Ilana Feldman is Interim Dean at the Elliot School of International Affairs and Professor of Anthropology, History, and International Affairs at George Washington University. Her research has focused on the Palestinian experience, both inside and outside of historic Palestine, examining practices of government, humanitarianism, policing, displacement, and citizenship. She is the author of Governing Gaza, Bureaucracy, Authority, and the Work of Rule, 1917 to 67. Also, Police Encounters, Security and Surveillance in Gaza under Egyptian Rule. Also, the book I was referring to and that you had the chapter to read from, Life Lived in Relief, Humanitarian Predicaments in Palestinian Refugee Politics. And she is also co-editor with Miriam Ticktin of In the Name of Humanity, the Government of Threat and Care. Please welcome Ilana Feldman.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you for inviting me. I'm gonna try to, let me see. I'm gonna share my screen. Successful. All right, I thought actually maybe I should say a word or two at the outset about what I'm, sort of how I think what I'm going to talk about fits into your overall project for this workshop for the summer. Because I should say I'm not, unlike Natasha, who has a comparative project across regions. My work is really focused on the Middle East, so it is, in some sense comparative across spaces, but it's Middle Eastern spaces. And I'm not going to talk directly about COVID today, but I think the case of Palestinian refugees, which is what I am going to focus on, is of course vital for thinking about COVID response in the region. So it's kind of going to be in some sense an orthogonal. You can think about the ways in which when governments and aid agencies and international organizations are thinking about how to tackle this new crisis, they are doing so overlaid upon many existing crises, many existing vulnerabilities, and also highlight the ways in which crisis is overlaid with, on top of and sort of intersects with chronic kind of conditions. And the Palestinian refugee case is a key instance of that, where you see kind of, and this is something I'll talk about, the kind of move from the chronic to the crisis back to the chronic. And the other way in which I think that the case of Palestinian refugees intersects very specifically with COVID response in the Middle East is that refugees are a particularly vulnerable population. Palestinian refugees, not alone in that, but certainly among that. Refugee camps are particularly vulnerable spaces when you think about trying to contain a pandemic that requires isolation to halt its spread, and you have camps that are very crowded. And it's very, very difficult for people to maintain those isolations. So I think when we think about, how is this latest global crisis affecting a region that has known many crises over the years, we want to recognize that it affects it through all of those existing conditions and circumstances. So I have, as Peter kind of indicated, I have been doing research on Palestinian refugees and their experience living with humanitarianism for more than a decade, and have been doing research on Palestinians and their experience for, 30 years now. But specifically the work that culminated in the book Life Lived in Relief, I conducted over the course of about a decade. And I was trying to look at a phenomenon that, as I said, spans multiple locations, and I'll try to take you through some of those locations, and many decades. So it's a challenging research project because of the long amount of time and the multiple spaces that I was investigating, but it really gave me an opportunity to understand both this population's multi-dimensional experience with displacement, multi-dimensional experience with humanitarian assistance, and also let me understand the ways in which humanitarianism has been transformed, not just for Palestinians, but globally over the course of these 7 decades. So let me see if I can advance the slide. Okay, I want to spend just a bit of time giving you some historical background to the case that I'm talking about. And obviously, I think everybody, whatever you know about the question of Palestine, however little or however much, you know that it is incredibly complicated and filled with all sorts of details. I will try to just, give you a framework for making some sense of it. And I am very happy. I know that we'll have time for questions at the end, but I'm also very happy to pause at any point along the way to make sure that I'm not losing you about the framework in which I'm talking, and to answer any particular questions that you have. And I'll try to remember to actually pause for some questions, but feel free to raise your virtual hand at any point, and I can address them. So, the question of Palestinian refugees, right, Palestinian displacement, begins in the years around 1948, starting from before 1948 and continuing on past it. The 1948 was the year of the establishment of the State of Israel out of part of the territory that had been Mandate Palestine. And in the course of the fighting that took place around that establishment before and after, about 750,000 Palestinians were displaced from their homes. And this slide that I have on the screen now gives you a sense of the kind of population movement that was happening during those years, movement in and out of the territory that had been Palestine. So you can see the arrows moving in. Those are Jewish populations that move in as Israel is established. And then the arrows moving out are Palestinian populations be displaced in this process. And the kind of thickness of the arrow gives you some sense of the kind of size of the population that is moving. So there were obviously many, many consequences of the events of 1948, and this process of displacement is known in Arabic and to Palestinians as the Nakba, which means catastrophe, right? Because this event, this displacement was utterly catastrophic to Palestinian life and society. So one of the things, of course, that happened in the process of the Nakba was a fragmentation of Palestinian society and political community, right? So a group of people that had lived within a single territory under a single polity, even though it was not an independent polity, is now scattered across multiple territories, living under multiple governments. So Palestinians went to Lebanon, to Syria, to Jordan. They went to the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which I will say a little bit more about, but those are territories that were part of historic Palestine that are now sort of separated out. So you have a population that had lived together, now living apart and under different governing regimes. But in addition to fragmenting and separating the population, the Nakba also created some things. It created a new and ultimately very important Palestinian subject and ultimately political actor, which is the refugee, right? If you look at Palestinian history, Palestinian political movements, Palestinian culture, the refugee as a figure and refugees as a community is really central to the ways in which Palestinians have thought of themselves in the years since 1948. So that is a creation of those events. And it's a category that then takes on kind of a life of its own. 1948 also led to the creation of a new institution of governance, service, and care for this population. That institution is UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees, which I will again say more about as we go forward. But UNRWA is a distinct agency in the international kind of humanitarian landscape, in that it is dedicated and devoted specifically to the provision of services to Palestinian refugees rather than to a generic refugee population. The UNHCR, the UN High Commission for Refugees, is the agency that is responsible for protection for other refugee populations around the world. Before UNRWA was established, and it was established in 1950, aid was first delivered to Palestinian refugees by volunteer agencies that were funded by the United Nations. But the very establishment of UNRWA was a recognition that this problem, which initially, the hope would be that this is a very short-term crisis, right? People in need, and these circumstances will be resolved. But as it became clear fairly quickly that that resolution was not coming quickly. And so the UN moved from basically providing funds to existing agencies to creating a standalone agency to provide assistance. But even in that recognition, that creation is a recognition that this problem is already longer term than it was thought it was going to be. But there was still a hope, expectation that this would be soon resolved one way or another. So UNRWA has always had extremely short mandates. That is, the agency is brought into existence with the kind of permission to exist for a year, for 3 years, for 5 years. And so its authority, its mandate needs to be renewed on a very regular basis. And that's challenging for the operations of an organization which has become a very large institution, providing all sorts of services to this population. So there's kind of a contradiction. There are many contradictions built into UNRWA, but one of them is that you have short-term mandates and very long-term presence, right? So that always affects the kind of planning that this organization undertakes. Another thing to note about UNRWA is in some sense, the contradiction or the tension that's built into its very name. So it's the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. So it was mandated to provide rations and assistance to people, but also mandated to work towards the settlement of these populations. And for a range of reasons, that resettlement mission, what kind of, to a certain extent, fell to the wayside, partly because the host countries where refugees were living couldn't really absorb these populations in the ways that were originally imagined, and also because Palestinian refugees refused the idea that they should simply be absorbed into neighboring countries, and rather insisted and have continued to insist on their political rights, not just as individuals, but as a community. So, but nonetheless, so even as large-scale resettlement kind of went by the wayside, there has always been a kind of developmental side of UNRWA's activity alongside the kind of relief work. Actually, let me, as I said I would, pause. I have more things that may confuse you to say, but let me see if there are any questions at this point.
Folks are welcome to throw them into the chat, or I think we can also use the raise hand feature.
We're good?
Haven't received anything yet.
Oh, I think somebody has a hand raised.
Oh, there we go. Yes, Bess.
Hello, welcome. Thank you so much. There's, again, so much history here. And My interest is that this occurred, like if we think about it historically, right after the World War II, right?
Mm-hmm.
So why the, like, I guess the time span, right? It was, so how long it was, it like 4 to 6 years after that?
So even, right, begins, so World War II ends in 1945. You know, obviously the circumstances that were leading to this displacement were already underway before then, but the fighting kind of begins in 47, and the 1948 is the beginning of really the sort of formal year zero in some sense. So 3 years really.
Thank you.
And I will, in a few minutes, I'll try to sort of say a little bit about the way that this refugee category intersects with other refugee categories that were emerging at the same time. But everything, you are correct, not just to note the kind of temporal, that they were close in time, but to think that there's an impact of the one on the other, right? So let me, go on here, and again, I will, I'll pause again in a few minutes. But this is a map, and you can't probably see all the details, and that is fine. But what it shows is the dispersion of Palestinian refugee camps across what are known as 5 fields of operation for UNRWA. So there are basically 5 jurisdictional spaces in which UNRWA operates and provides assistance to Palestinian refugees: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, West Bank, and Gaza. There are 58 official camps across those 5 fields of operations. There are a number of unofficial camps as well. And in case you're interested, I'm not really going to talk today about the details of my field work, but just to sort of further locate what I was doing in this broad map. For the book that you read a chapter of, I did a lot of archival research, but I did ethnographic field work in primarily 4 refugee camps in 3 fields of operation. So in Borj-Barajne in Lebanon, in Jedis and Wihdat in Jordan, and in Dheisheh in the West Bank. I had spent 2 years in Gaza in the late 90s doing research for my earlier books. And so I drew on some of that material as well as archival material for Gaza. Doing work in Gaza now is very difficult. And when I first began this research, I intended, and in my grant applications, I had a fieldwork in Syria component, but that became impossible because of the conflict in Syria. But you have this dynamic where you have in some sense, a single humanitarian institution. There are many others that also provide aid to Palestinians, but UNRWA is the one that exists across all the spaces and throughout all the decades of Palestinian displacement. So you have this umbrella institution providing assistance and services to refugees, but very different political, social, economic conditions in the different places where Palestinians have been refugees. So just to give you like a tiny bit of a taste of those differences, because again, this is, there's a long detailed history in every place. Lebanon is a circumstance where Palestinians face a great deal of exclusion from the economy, from the polity, from public discourse, right? So right now, Lebanon is a very difficult place for to live as a Palestinian refugee. But it was the center of Palestinian national politics during the 1970s. So there were years where Lebanon was a place where there was kind of a Palestinian state in exile. And so it was kind of this, in some sense, a central place to be a Palestinian refugee, because the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, was centered there, and they provided not just services, but economic development, cultural development, political organization and had a military wing. And once they were in the course of fighting part of both the Lebanese Civil War and the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the PLO was expelled from Lebanon, but left behind a large population of Palestinian refugees for whom life has only gotten, I mean, it's not the same as in the height of the Civil War, but for whom life has gotten structurally difficult in the years since then. In contrast, in Syria, prior to the current conflict, in which life for Palestinian refugees and life for everyone in Syria has gotten extremely difficult, Syria was a place that I think a lot of people would have said was one of the better places to live as a Palestinian refugee. People were treated, in some sense, almost like citizens. They did not have citizenship, and that's partly with the goal of maintaining a distinct Palestinian identity and also to support Palestinian claims to return. But even though they were not citizens, they had access to government jobs, to military service. So they were incorporated into the society, not identically to Syrian citizens, but very, very closely incorporated. And they lived under the same restrictions as other Syrian citizens did in terms of freedom of expression, opportunity for political organization and movement, right? So Syria was not a space of freedom for anyone who lived in Syria. But in terms of the position of being a Palestinian refugee was people were fairly well incorporated. In Jordan, and I know this is a lot, and I will, again, pause after I've taken you through this tour of the five fields. But in Jordan, Palestinian refugees are by and large citizens of the country. So this is a very distinctive way to be a refugee. And they were made citizens very early on after their displacement. And you have a dynamic where the majority of the population is Palestinian. But their place in Jordanian society and Jordanian identity remains very vexed, right? There's so even as demographically Jordan is very Palestinian, there are lots of questions and at different moments, different tensions around how kind of culturally Palestinian it can be. And to what extent does Palestinian presence, like the presence of Palestinian identity within the Palestinian demography, to what extent does that pose a risk to Jordanian national identity? So this is a source of tension. And around 1970, the early 70s, there was an outright conflict between the Palestine Liberation Organization and the Jordanian government. So this tension has at times erupted into conflict. But by and large, again, the fact that Palestinians are citizens of the country makes a very big difference for the circumstances of their lives. The West Bank, to look just a little bit over from Jordan, was between 1948 and 1967 actually part of Jordan. Jordan occupied that territory in the course of the 1948 war and annexed it to the country. So the Palestinian refugee population and the non-refugee Palestinian population that lived in the West Bank were Jordanian citizens up to and then even after 1967. In 1967, people may know there was a major war between Israel and neighboring Arab countries, and Israel occupied the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and also the Sinai Peninsula. So 1967 marks a major breaking point for the West Bank as a territory and as a refugee space. The Gaza Strip between 1948 and 1967 was administered by Egypt. Egypt never annexed it and therefore did not make Palestinians in Gaza citizens of Egypt. It tried to govern it as a distinct Palestinian territory, and the Egyptian government often used that at that time as kind of a rhetorical point against its, kind of in its contestations with the Jordanian authorities to say that they were the only defenders of Palestine, right? Jordan had annexed territories of Palestine, but Egypt was preserving this space of Palestine for future liberation. Not that they were actually doing very much to support that, but that was a rhetorical position. And then again, in 1967, Gaza is occupied by Israel. And one of the consequences of that occupation was that the territories that had been completely separated from each other came together under a shared polity, right? So they have a shared occupying force. Israel's occupying the West Bank and Gaza. It's not independence, it's occupation, but it's for the first time in 20 years, those two territories were under a single governing force. In 1993, the PLO and Israel signed a set of accords known as the Oslo Accords, which led to the establishment of a Palestinian National Authority in the West Bank and Gaza. At the time, there was great hope among Palestinians that the establishment of that authority was a move towards the establishment of a Palestinian state in those territories. That didn't happen. If anything, things are now, how many years on are we? 25. Much further from that establishment. But again, in terms of thinking about refugee conditions, the establishment of the Palestinian Authority did have significant consequences, because in every place where refugees are located and in every place where UNRWA works, UNRWA has to negotiate with, work in concert with, have relationships to the host government. So in Lebanon, you've got one host government. Of course, circumstances of that government have changed dramatically over the years, but Lebanon is Lebanon, and and the UNRWA's relationships with that government are construed by those particular agreements and arrangements. For the West Bank and Gaza, you have had 3 separate host countries over those territories, right? For the West Bank, Jordan to Israel to Palestinian Authority. For Gaza, Egypt to Israel to Palestinian Authority. And then you have another kind of paradox in that the Palestinian Authority is a host government for Palestinian refugee populations. So this is a very complicated set of dynamics, and every aspect of humanitarian operations and refugee life is shaped by those specific complications in the places where they are, even as you have a phenomenon and an institution that goes across those boundaries. So let me pause again, because that was a lot very quickly, and just make sure that I haven't totally confused you, or see what I can do to clear up any confusion I may have introduced.
So I think we have 2 questions, Ilana. One came through to the chat from David Bidar. He asked, to what extent were neighboring Arab countries unable to absorb refugees or unwilling to do so?
So I would say it's a bit of both, right? So you saw Gaza is a good example. The territory that became the Gaza Strip before 1948 housed about 80,000 people. And then somewhere between 200 and 250,000 refugees moved into that territory. So when you're thinking about what it would mean to absorb, settle a population like that in this very small territory, it's really not possible, right? So there's not enough resources, not enough space to have this sort of, those kind of developmental picture of what absorption would look like. And at the same time, there is a great deal of unwillingness, but for multiple reasons, both because Palestinians are unwilling to be settled, right, rather than return. The right of return has been a central Palestinian claim since 1948. So for a host country to push settlement, and there are moments where they do, but for a host country to do that is to enter into conflict with your refugee population, which can be a security problem, right? That can be challenging to the state itself. And then countries have their own reasons for not wanting to settle refugee populations. So Lebanon, for example, there's a huge amount of discourse among Lebanese about their support for Palestinian return and identity, and they will never support resettlement because of their concern for Palestinians. But as much or more of that concern is about Lebanese concern about what the permanent presence of Palestinians would mean for Lebanese demography, Lebanese politics. Lebanon is very carefully calibrated around people's sense of the sectarian distribution, Sunni, Shi'i, Christian. And so there's a sense that bringing Palestinians into that polity would disrupt those relationships. So I would say it's always multiple things: incapacity, and then refusal, which itself is multiple in its reasoning. But I will say that Palestinians have insisted throughout that resettlement is not the answer to their circumstance.
There's a question from Nadia Mohammed. I can ask you to unmute.
Yeah. I've got two questions. First, thank you so much for the information. And you talked about the annexation of the West Bank to Jordan that was between like 1946 to 1967. And I heard the term like occupied, as if like Jordan occupied the West Bank. But if I'm not mistaken, that type maybe of sovereignty was under the name of unity of both banks of the River of Jordan, which made it possible for Jordan to give citizenship, because it's the only country that the government of Jordan that give Palestinian refugees citizenship. As you mentioned, yes, some countries like, let's say, Syria, gave them maybe some rights, but not citizenship, which is completely different when it comes to travel and to other benefits. Same thing like the situation in Egypt, Lebanon. So no Palestinian refugees got citizenship except Jordan. Forget about maybe the times of tensions, that is in 1970, but other than that, that made it possible for the government to give citizenship, and it was even in Arabic under the name Wahdat al-Duffatain, if I'm not mistaken. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, so this is a window into the ways in which people, both the relationships to the population but also to territory, change over time, right? So the Jordan absorbed the West Bank into prior to Jordanian independence. This was sort of trans-Jordan. The country is established, and then it grows in the course of the war. It is possible for Jordan to absorb the West Bank because of territory gained in conflict. And there's a lot of interesting work that's been done about the sort of what historian Avi Schleim calls collusion across the Jordan, about the sort of arrangements between what became the Israeli forces and the Jordanian government to enable Jordan to get this territory. But then, yes, it absorbs this territory and its population, and everybody is made a citizen of the country. And even after 1967, Jordan continued to maintain that relationship. It obviously didn't control the territory anymore, but it continued to claim it until during the course of the first Intifada, which is the first Palestinian uprising against the Israeli occupation, Palestinians made the Palestinian claim for independence led Jordan to basically, in some sense, renounce its claims to the West Bank in favor of Palestinian independence over that territory. So both the government's relationship to the territory and the population's relationship both to the territory and to Jordan as a governing force change over time.
Okay, I have one more question, and thank you for answering that question. The role of UNRWA in Jordan to, help and aid Palestinian refugees, wasn't it like 3 years ago that UNRWA stopped any kind of aid to Palestinian refugees in Jordan?
It hasn't stopped anywhere, but it is under enormous financial stress, right? So, and this has been a feature of UNRWA in some sense from the beginning, but over recent years, it has become increasingly so for a number of reasons. I mean, you both have a growing population and a general kind of anemic support from the international community. UNRWA is funded entirely by voluntary contributions by UN member states. So its budget is precarious at best. And the Trump administration, among those voluntary contributions, the United States has always been the largest donor to UNRWA. And we can talk later maybe about some of the reasons for that, but the Trump administration stopped all US contributions to UNRWA, which has had a devastating effect on the organization. Now, some other countries have come in to fill in some of those gaps, but the stress is real and significant.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for answering those questions, Ilana. We do have a couple more questions, but I'm going to take a wild guess and say that they might be better addressed after whatever the next portion of your presentation is. Okay. So if it's all right for Bess and Mustafa, we'll hold those questions until the next pause, because guessing where you're going to go, they might be better off answered then.
Okay, sounds good, and we can definitely come back to them. So one of the things that I want to say, we've been talking now about a lot of the details about Palestinian experience and the specificity of this case. But one of the things that I want to gesture to also is the ways in which this case is emblematic and paradigmatic, right? It's easy to think that the Palestinian instance is exceptional or, really different than other refugee populations, so long-standing, so politically complicated. But in fact, protracted displacement, that is long-term displacement, is the most common refugee experience, right? It is not the exception, it is rather the norm. So 70 years is on one kind of extreme of that spectrum of long-term displacement. But the fact of long-term displacement, and therefore the particular problems that emerge when you're dealing with long-term displacement, is not at all unique to Palestinians. So I think that this is something that we all need to confront, right? Scholars, practitioners, publics need to recognize the fact that long-term humanitarian presence is not exceptional, and we need to start thinking about, when we're thinking about humanitarian assistance or refugee experience, to recognize that is kind of a feature of this condition. But at the same time, I do want to continue to underscore the ways in which this experience is distinctive. And one has to do with, as I've kind of gestured to a little bit already, the very category of the refugee, right, and the agencies that provide assistance. So most refugees around the world, right, and the category refugee is an incomplete category in terms of capturing everybody who is displaced and in need and vulnerable because of war or disaster or other circumstances, right? It doesn't cover everything, but most people who are recognized as refugees fall under this convention, which is the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees. And I have up here the sort of basic definition of a refugee that is established by that convention, which is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear, people may have heard this phrase before, of being persecuted. I won't read through the whole thing because you can see it, but this is a definition that is meant to be general. That is, it doesn't describe a particular population. It doesn't describe a particular circumstance. It describes a kind of a setting, a circumstance, a set of experiences that would let people be recognized as refugees. And this is the definition that governs, you know, access to asylum as a refugee, that governs recognition as a refugee in terms of the UNHCR, UN High Commission for Refugees. And that is most people who are refugees now. Now, there's a long history to this convention and the incompleteness of this definition. But for now, what I want to highlight is that Palestinian refugees do not fall under the 1951 convention. They are not part of UNHCR's mandate, it's a general rule, and they have their own distinctive refugee definition. It's partly this population was made refugees prior to the convention, but there was also a specific decision ultimately to keep them apart. Partly because some of the host countries worried that if they were just folded into a generic refugee definition, that the significance of resolving this political circumstance would kind of dissipate. And of course, keeping them separate hasn't had the effect of resolving it, but that was one of the hopes. But a thing to know about this refugee definition is, unlike the convention definition, which is meant to provide protection as well as access to services, the definition of a Palestine refugee was first and foremost meant to determine who needed access, should have access, should be eligible for humanitarian services. So the question of protection, which we think of as really now one of the key parts of a humanitarian response to refugee circumstances, protection was not part of the initial mandate that UNRWA had, and it was not built into the definition of a refugee. And it also meant that the definition of a refugee did not ever encompass all of people's claims or all of people's losses. So there were, you know, as I mentioned, I did a lot of work in Gaza before this project, and there's a number of, you know, the majority of those people who were citizens of Gaza before 1948, that is, they were not refugees, they were not displaced from their homes, but their livelihood, their lands, their you know, on which they earned a living was on the other side of the border that became established with Gaza. So they were not displaced, but they were dispossessed, but therefore did not fall under the category of refugee and did not qualify for the emerging aid regime. So this is one of the ways in which both a bureaucratic category, a humanitarian category, a governance category that's established with a particular set of aims in mind, right? How do we deliver aid, ends up having complicated multiple sorts of effects, right? Not only does it show who can get assistance, it divides a population in new ways. And there was all sorts of tension in Gaza after 1948 between those who were getting aid and those who were not. So I want to talk a little bit now about the kind of long-term experience of displacement. So one of the things that happens over the course of 70 years as displacement becomes long-term is that for humanitarianism, crisis-oriented action needs to start dealing with chronic conditions, right? And this is a real challenge for humanitarian actors. And this is one of the things that I describe in the chapter that you read. From a Palestinian perspective, you have people who are living full lives within humanitarian settings, right? So that living full lives in multiple senses, that is living a full life cycle, right? You have people who are born and die as refugees. But it also means that you have people who are trying to do much more than survive within a setting that is at least theoretically oriented to support survival and not the full range of people's activities. So there are a lot of consequences of this kind of conundrum of the long term for humanitarianism and for refugee populations. And one way to see this, I often think that the kind of visual of camps can give you a little bit of a window into the dynamics of the long term. So these are images of some of the refugee camps that I've worked in now, right, or relatively recently, in recent decades. And places like this they don't look like refugee camps as we commonly imagine them, right? We tend to think about refugee camps as a sprawl of tents, very closely managed by humanitarian actors. And the Palestinian refugee camps did begin that way. But over time, they necessarily had to change. And this kind of change is inevitable in any human settlement that's in existence for 70 years, right? It's impossible for places not to change. But nonetheless, people tend to think about refugee camps as places without histories, right? And that one of the things that that looking over the long term really highlights is just how deep, complex, and multi-layered the histories of these spaces are. So if we turn from sort of camps in recent years back to images from shortly after 1948, these pictures look much more like the kind of classic image of a camp. And not only and I mean that in two senses. They are both ephemeral, right? So they're built of tents, which are not permanent. They can easily be removed or be damaged, but they are also highly ordered, right? You can see the kind of presence of the humanitarian governance apparatus in the layout of these camps. And one thing that happens over time is that you begin to move away kind of slowly from some of that. So on the one hand, you also have camps, the picture of the Khan Yunis camp shows you a camp that was built out of kind of repurposed military barracks. So camps do start with multiple kind of materialities. But in the image of the Makkah camp, you see in some sense a midpoint in humanitarian architecture, right? You're moving away from tents, these kind of prefab buildings, but yet the kind of humanitarian ordering remains highly visible in the landscape. But over years, as again, population grows, people are living there, not only do you no longer have tents, right? You have much more durable, if not fully kind of permanent settlements, but you also see visually that the ways that people live in the space kind of overtakes the humanitarian ordering of those spaces, right? Humanitarian presence remains, but it's people's living, building, even if they're not allowed to, crowding in, making use of the space. That comes to be what is dominant. And these are pictures from Borja Barajne in Lebanon, just to give you some sense of the density of these spaces over time. So camps, have a material history, social history that is only very partly contained by the humanitarian organizations that provide services to them. And not only do camps change, right, the services that are provided to refugees change. In the first years, after 1948, in the first years of UNRWA's establishment, basically rations were provided to everybody who was a recognized refugee. And over the years, the numbers of people who are eligible for rations has been dramatically diminished. And it's gone from, almost everybody to, certain categories of people based on income would get either no rations or limited rations, to now where almost nobody gets rations. Only the very poorest, and in sort of emergent crisis situations do people receive rations. So a service that was at the heart of kind of humanitarian care in the early years has radically transformed and receded from the humanitarian landscape. But rations provision was always only one thing that humanitarians did. UNRWA has also provided job training to people. And, so this question of settlement that we were talking about a little bit before, that's one of the ways in which UNRWA has shifted, right? In the early years, there were some efforts and some planning for major projects of resettlement, like things like the Tennessee Valley Authority in the Jordan Valley, where you could where you could really kind of create permanent new communities. And as those it became clear that those were impossible, there's been an increasing focus on providing refugees with marketable job skills. So that, again, is a transformation in a particular kind of service. Education has always been at the center of UNRWA's service provision to refugees. And this is, I think, now education and healthcare are really the key things that UNRWA does for people. And so healthcare is here. And you read a little bit in the chapter about some of the challenges in providing healthcare over the long term. So, pause. I know, I'm happy to take any urgent questions, but otherwise I can move on. James, do you think we should pause?
I think it should be all right to move on. We have a few things in the chat, but they might all be better addressed kind of as a bunch at the end, if that works for you. That's more comfortable.
Yeah, that's fine. And I also realize that I'm, as is always the case, taking more time than I thought I would. I was like, I'm not sure that I'll need a full 45 minutes, but on I go. So also holler at me when I should just begin to, I'll try to move towards wrapping up, but also holler at me. So let me say a little bit about, I kind of framed this around living and dying in the humanitarian condition. So I want to just say a little bit about some of those challenges on both sides, right? What are the dilemmas of living as a refugee over the long term? And this photograph, which is from the UNRWA photo archives, as are many of the photos that I've been showing you, to me in some ways encapsulates some of those dilemmas of living. For people who are familiar with Palestinian political iconography, you will be aware that the image of the key is really central to that Palestinian iconography. And that key is sort of symbolically the keys to people's homes that they left and lost in 1948. The keys in this image are somewhat different keys. I mean, structurally, they look the same, but what they are keys to is houses that were being built. This is in the Aida refugee camp in the West Bank. Houses that were being built, shelters that were being built to move people from camps into shelters. So there's always a dilemma for people of how much do you live as a refugee? That is how full, we talked about the question of settlement and people don't want to settle, but even as they don't want to be resettled and they want to make a claim to return, when you're talking about decades, you're talking about raising children, you can't just hold still in survival mode, waiting for that opportunity to go home. You have to build a life for yourself. And so questions about, do you accept a house? Do you move outside of the camp? These are challenges that emerge over the long term. And people would talk to me all the time in the course of my research about the kinds of dilemmas that people face. In the first years after 1948, there were people who said, I don't want to go on the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, from displacement. I want to wait until I'm home and go from there. And and sadly, the people who made the choice never got to go, right? Many people died waiting for that opportunity. In a slightly more mundane, but nonetheless consequential for people's everyday lives. And people would say, my father told me we shouldn't buy a car because to buy a car is to suggest that I'm living here and not ready to return. But inevitably people live in a whole range of ways. And there really are very generational differences in how people grapple with this dilemma. It's a dilemma that persists, but for people who are born as refugees, rather than that first generation who became refugees, they sort of recognize that it's pragmatically not possible not to live, but also people have been able to bring together for themselves the sense that they should be able to have and do both. Have a good life, a safe life, even a prosperous life where they are living, and have claims to national liberation or return or national community. And they try to hold these things together, but it is a real source of tension. you know, these are images that give you, in some sense, some window into that tension, some of those tensions. So this is a picture from the Jedis refugee camp in Jordan, and what it says on the side of that shelter is house for sale. Now, technically, refugees don't own their shelters, right? But practically, they are their homes, and there is a very vibrant market for both rental and sale in these properties, because what else is going to happen over the course of 70 years, right? Even if you don't have formal property rights, people live in these spaces as their own. And this is an image of what, you know, was dubbed the suburb outside of the Dheisheh refugee camp in the West Bank, right? It is impossible for every refugee to live in a camp. It was never true that every refugee lived in a camp, but over years, people, both because they've had opportunity and also, you know, because there's limited space in the camp, people have had to move outside or have wanted to move outside. But then people sort of grapple with the question of what does it mean for them? What does it mean for their identity as a refugee to move outside of the camp? What does it mean for their political claims as a refugee to move outside of the camp? And again, these things are not easily resolvable, but are actually definitional of what it means to be a refugee over the long term, is to grapple with these tensions, challenges, discordances of refugee life. So now to say something about some of the problems of dying. And of course, in terms of the humanitarianism as a field, the question of death and dying is at the center of humanitarian action, right? Humanitarians often say that their aim is, or the aim of this practice is to stop people from dying from stupid things. That is, you shouldn't die because your government can't care for you. You shouldn't die in war. You shouldn't, you know, die from non-natural causes. And humanitarianism exists to intervene in those circumstances that make people vulnerable to this kind of death. But one of the things that happens over the long term, and again, thinking in this case, we're talking about 7 decades, more than 7 decades, is that those people who are refugees and those people who are recipients of humanitarian aid are also going to die of human reasons, right? Natural causes, die of old age, die of illness, die of things that don't have an immediate direct humanitarian cause. And yet those lives and those deaths are, you know, part of the concern for humanitarian actors. If you're providing aid to a refugee population, you need to deal with the question of what do you do with the elderly in that population. And it has been very difficult for humanitarians to really adequately address that, both because of the kind of existential challenge that the question of ordinary dying poses to the kind of crisis orientation of humanitarian actors, and also because of the tremendous expense that's involved in providing some of this care. And that's where, you know, the quote that Peter mentioned at the beginning, that I would hear from Palestinian refugees in Lebanon specifically, that Palestinian refugees don't have the right to live past 60, was referencing a kind of withdrawal of some health services to the elderly, really as a matter of triage and lack of capacity. But this, you know, just highlights some of the true challenges of what the long term introduces to both humanitarian providers and recipient populations. There are other, so that's getting old. There are other ways in which, so, you know, aging is a particular problem. The very infrastructure, so I started by sort of talking about the materiality of camps and the way that materiality has changed. But the infrastructure of those camps are felt by the people who live in them to be a threat to their lives, right? You have these kind of jerry-rigged, especially in Lebanon, these jerry-rigged electricity systems, which is not only in the camps, you see it in other places in Lebanon. But I would hear lots of stories about people being electrocuted, especially in the winter when the camps would flood. In the Jedis camp, when I was doing field work there were open sewers in the camp, so that people live with a sense that their space of refuge is also a space that causes them harm to their health. And also people worry a great deal about the psychic harm of the circumstances in which they live, and really see that as not just kind of an accidental or incidental effect of long-term displacement, but as part of a targeted attack on their community. That part of the goal is to dissipate Palestinian identity and Palestinian claim making. And that is done in some ways through the Palestinian psyche. And just so I don't end on a totally gloomy note, I will say that there is always, so just as I started by saying everything is complicated, multiple, right? What a refugee camp is multiple things. How people feel and experience this long term is also multiple things. So even with all the worries that people have, their sense of being under attack, a sense, especially in recent years, of kind of near defeat of the Palestinian project in some ways. That's never all there is. So but you have kind of creative action, creative politics, and this is just one small expression of this sort of insistence, people's continued insistence, both on their existence as individuals and as a community, and on the possibility of a future, even as that, even as it seems to be blocked in many ways.
Thank you so much, Ilana. That was great. I'm going to have a round of applause here. But if I can take the privilege as the moderator here and just say, one of the reasons I think Peter and I, or at least from my own experience, thought to invite you to this workshop, and your work is particularly Life Lived in Relief, was on my mind in the middle of the pandemic. There was a lot of conversation in the middle of March and early April about the rationing of healthcare in the face of this pandemic. And I particularly remember this one article in the Atlantic getting circulated around, all of my friends on social media. I think it was by Yasha Malk or something like this, about, this sort of philosophical trolley problem of like who gets a ventilator and when and how old. And one thing that just sat very uncomfortably with me about that article was that it treated this problem like a new problem, like one that but what we know from your work is that actually this is something that is in many ways has been worked out already, and not by philosophers, but by the people who work in refugee camps. The logic that ends up with, we can't give life-saving measures to Palestinian refugees over the age of 60, because that's just, that's our triage system. These are things that have in many ways already been dealt with and worked out in places that we don't really consider, in the middle of the pandemic. So I wondered if you have anything to say about the way that sort of the logic of that particular kind of triage may have been exported or not in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that that's striking, and I think maybe this is partly what you're gesturing to in the question itself, is that, I mean, and this is the particular sort of American, sense of exceptionalism, is that the belief that that limits, problems, shortcomings that other places and people experience are somehow outside of our own circumstance. And so the idea, even in the United States, it's not new. Healthcare is always rationed. Everything is always rationed. Triage is a central principle of the provision of healthcare. It is also central to humanitarian practice. It is one of these, like, ethically, right? There is no ethical resolution to the problem of triage. It is the most ethical thing to do. It is the most ethically challenging thing to do. It means to turn away from somebody on purpose, right? But if you don't make that choice, then you're turning away. I guess it is the trolley problem in some sense. One of the things that I think actually, the instance of Palestinians, both in terms of that specific case in Lebanon where people were being sort of withheld certain kinds of services, but in general makes clear is that these determinations, right? The triage determination is neither just a technical, technocratic expert, set of decision-making, nor are its pathways completely set. Because in the Palestinian case, you can really see very clearly the ways in which refugee action, refugee demands has not made everything available, in unlimited terms to everybody, because there's a real limitation of resources, but has changed the considerations of providers, right? And so when we want to think about how do we think about these questions, one of the things that Palestinians have learned, and I think we, kind of analogously need to learn, is that we are participants in this dynamic, not just recipients of it. So if we read something about what, the triage of healthcare, or the sort of brutal question of who you put on a ventilator, this isn't something we're just watching, nurses and doctors in the hospital do. We are actually participating in it, whether we know it or not, and we can have an influence. Again, not to say that we make those shortages go away, but how those decisions are made, what constitutes value, right, is something that we all are shaping all the time.
Absolutely. So sort of leading into this a bit, a couple of questions that came in earlier, but I think I better address now. Bess Morales asked, what was the trauma to families and children due to the destabilization of refugee camps, particularly regarding schooling and health? You addressed this a little bit in the talk, but if you could expand a little bit on trauma in particular in these cases.
Yeah, so I mean, again, this is something that is quite multi-layered, because there's been multiple traumas, right? Multiple moments of crisis that have disrupted people's circumstances, right? 1948, that initial displacement is obviously a kind of national trauma, right? The entire community is disrupted by it, and obviously for families and individuals as well. But then, in different places at different times, you've had the active destruction, sometimes complete destruction of camps that is gone forever, Tel Zatar in Lebanon, sometimes destruction in the course of war that then it is rebuilt, Wahdat in 1970, Burj Barajne or Shatila in Lebanon. So there are, there are different moments of kind of traumatic experience for people. But there's also a very active, and this may not be the nature of your question, but I think it's worth noting that there's very active conversation among Palestinians, and particularly among Palestinian mental health providers, about the extent to which the language of trauma and the framework of trauma as a response to crisis, devastation, destruction is adequate or appropriate to the Palestinian case. And I don't think there's not an answer to that, right? This is an active kind of debate, but I think we sometimes think that there's necessarily a universal language to describe the effects of terrible, terrible things, the effects of violence, the effects of deprivation. But in fact, these things can be quite varied. So there's a whole apparatus of trying to think about how do you provide care? What does it mean to provide mental health care to refugees under these circumstances?
Wonderful, thank you. Great answer to the question. The next question I have in the chat comes from Mustafa Hassan. He asks you to elaborate a little bit on the deal of the century and what are the chances this deal could be successfully accepted by Palestinians or even implementable at all, or in particular, if there's an impact on the refugee issue that you think is significant. It would be helpful to get your take on that.
Yeah, I don't think very much of the deal of the century. I think it is neither, it's not a good deal. It's not really, anyway, it's kind of a non-starter, but this is, it is part of, even as it is not going to, tie things up, resolve, bring us to resolution, it does have an impact on refugees, not just the sort of forwarding of this deal, but the whole direction of of US politics over the last few years put center stage an effort that has been ongoing for many years, but used to be, I don't know if it was a fringe, but it was a particular position, which is to try to dissolve rather than resolve the Palestinian refugee condition and problem. So this effort has taken multiple forms, and the Trump administration has really taken up each of these efforts and tried to put it front and center. So one is there's been an effort to try to change the definition of a Palestine refugee from right now, the refugee status, like in other refugee circumstances, is sort of passed down generationally. So those people who are recognized as Palestinian refugees include both those who were displaced in 1948 and their descendants. And again, this is common, right? Refugee status is given to those who are born into refugee communities. But there's been a concerted effort to try to limit the category except to only those people who were themselves displaced in 1948, which, as you can imagine, is a quickly diminishing number because these people are very old. So that's one way to try to dissolve the refugee problem, is to simply define it out of existence so no more refugees remain. What I talked about a little bit before about the defunding of UNRWA is another effort, part of that effort to kind of dissolve the problem. And it's not only UNRWA that has been defunded, all sorts of US aid to Palestinians has been held back. So these are pressures that are being placed on both the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian community to one, stop making claims as refugees, but also to concede to and accept whatever is on offer, right? I don't think it'll happen. One, I don't think the Palestinian Authority will do it. But even if there was even if there could be kind of forced into some kind of compliance, it is to my view, such a bad offer, so non-responsive to Palestinian needs that it would not be likely to resolve this circumstance for very long.
I think the next question might have been answered in the answer to the last one, but we'll move into it. Cheryl Billingsley asks for refugees that were not given citizenship in other places besides Jordan, what happens to children born in these camps that were also labeled as non-citizens? So, I mean, perhaps you could expand a little bit on the different ways in which refugee status is passed down through generations or not, and has that differed depending on the location?
Yeah, so it is, to the extent that refugee status is an UNRWA category, and it's governed by UNRWA's definition, it doesn't mostly depend that much on location, right? So UNRWA's definition applies whether you're a refugee in Lebanon or in Jordan or in Syria. One thing that is notable about, in some sense it's not surprising, but it, from our current perspective, may seem surprising, is that the definition is, like many things, patriarchal, right? So refugee status is passed down to children through the male line. So women, if you have a woman who is a Palestinian refugee married to a Jordanian non-refugee, she was not able to pass on refugee status to her children. Initially, women who married non-refugees were removed from the roles. Now these limitations in the status have been kind of worked around in recent years, that it's been, that it has become more possible to pass that on. And in some sense, as refugee status has come along with fewer entitlements, right? There are no rations anymore, like the services that you get as a refugee are more limited. So it becomes more possible to allow other groups in. But in every country, and so I guess here is where there is a difference, right? It's not a definitional difference, but in every country, every field of operations, there was what was known as a ration ceiling, right? There's budget problems from the beginning. UNRWA can only afford so many services. And so when they reach that ceiling, even if you have people who, according to the definition, should be registered as refugees, so babies born to a refugee father who wasn't in need, right, who fit all of the categories, if they were above that ceiling, those babies were not registered. So that's one of the reasons why central to UNRWA's operations for its first decades of existence was this effort to control and manage the ration rolls, to be sure that, you know, anybody who, you know, had an income that would make them be removed from the rolls was removed from the rolls, and trying to bring people on. And this was a real source of tension between the agency and refugees, between the agency and the host governments, you know.
Wonderful. I don't have any more questions in the chat at the moment, and I don't see any hands raised, but if folks want to pop a question into the chat or raise their hand, they're more than welcome. I might also throw the mic to Peter if he's got any follow-up questions.
Thank you very much for your awesome presentation. Really great. I was wondering if you could elaborate on this issue of limits to humanitarianism, right? We think of humanitarianism as a problem solver, goes in and it solves places, but you talk about it in a limited and constrained manner. Is there anywhere in the world where it operates without constraints or limits? Is it just in the Palestinian case, or is this just a rule across the board?
So yeah, it's a great question. And I would say it's, I mean, I'll then complexify it, but it's a rule across the board, but in multiple different kinds of, in several different ways. Not just because there are limits to resources, but actually because it is meant to be limited. This is a form of intervention that says, you know, we're gonna do this and not this other thing, right? We're gonna save lives, not build societies. We're going to provide health care, not, you know, kind of do major development, you know. And part of the effort is to, in self-defining as limited, is to create a space of opportunity for action, right? We are non-political, we are neutral, we are impartial. These are the kind of principles of humanitarian actors and humanitarian action. And the idea is that, one, by limiting yourself in that way, by, you know, refusing politics actively, right? We are not going to engage in politics. We are not going to determine who is at fault for these circumstances, right? We don't ask what makes a refugee. We ask who is in need. That by limiting the aperture and limiting what we try to do, we are more likely to be able to do those things. We will be able to save lives if we don't try to advocate for rights. And if we try to advocate for rights, we're not going to have access, and we're not going to be able to save lives. So there is a self-conscious limitation that's kind of built into how most humanitarian agencies think about themselves. Then there are the limitations that are imposed by circumstances, right? And these again they differ from place to place, but that there are limitations imposed by circumstances, I think, is a general condition. So what are those circumstances? Some of it has to do with funding, right? So, you know, we talked a lot about this, the donor's relationship to UNRWA and the stress on its finances, but in general, humanitarian agencies, except for Doctors Without Borders, which is very, very well funded, most humanitarian agencies struggle with not having enough funding, having to make difficult choices, like where do you go, who do you help? So it's a limit of funding. The question of the limits of access created by, whether by politics, by fighting, by topography, right? There are all sorts of ways in which people you might want to help, you cannot get to them. And that is another thing that I think you find in almost any humanitarian circumstance. And then, and here, I mean, this again is not unique to the Palestinian circumstance, but I think is one of the things that is shown especially clearly in the Palestinian circumstance is the limits of kind of humanitarian capacity to respond to chronic circumstances, right? So this is back to those dilemmas of the long term. How does a form of action that really thinks of itself in crisis terms, right? We're going to save you. What do you do when people, one, they're not at risk of dying, and two, you can't change very much for them. So saving them kind of comes off the table in certain circumstances when you're like really in these kind of stasis moments. And so humanitarian actors really struggle with what it means to do humanitarian work when you can neither save lives or improve lives.
Thank you. Let me just ask you a follow-up on that. And obviously, this is going to be a very political question, but I think you are able to handle heavily political questions. You know, given that the Trump has worked, as has other activists, to defund the different refugee works for Palestinians, the Israelis, as we see in your book and elsewhere, have tried at times throughout the decades to remove all the services, healthcare and otherwise, that are provided for Palestinians. And for example, very famous WikiLeaks document that came out in 2008 about the Israeli policy of pushing Palestinians to, quote, the brink of collapse, where the society has so few resources, so few life options for people, healthcare and food in particular, that in those conditions, they'll be willing to concede, or they'll be pushed into a corner where they might give up on certain claims. Could you connect that to the idea or the theory that you mentioned in your work of necropolitical? Are these what I'm describing, necropolitical policies?
I certainly think the Palestinians see them as necropolitical. Now, most refugees I was doing work with wouldn't use that particular theoretical language, but what they described as what they saw happening to them was exactly what we would think of as necropolitical. And for people on this call who might not be familiar with that terminology, it's a theoretical language that's meant to capture when politics seeks to kill, right? Where it's not, not just that, people, it's more than abandonment. It's actually that people need to die and need to be exposed to death in order to achieve other political aims. And Palestinians definitely see themselves as targeted in that way. But I feel like this isn't exactly apropos of what you were saying, but I feel like I should mention kind of another side to the question of the politics of humanitarian provisioning, because what I've been talking about and what a lot of the questions have been about so far is about the sort of the politics of when humanitarian aid is removed, right? And what, the ways in which that is harmful to people. But I think it's also important to recognize, if I'm thinking about how Palestinians think about the political meaning of humanitarian aid, they see that and they argue that. And at the same time, other Palestinians, and sometimes the same Palestinians, would argue that humanitarian aid itself is an effort to undo their political life, right? That people would say, like, the goal of humanitarian aid is that we would run after the flour sack rather than fight for our country, right? So there's a real concern that aid can impede politics, even as there's a concern that the withdrawal of aid is both an effort to impede politics and is itself a denial of political responsibility. So there is not a singular viewpoint about the political impact and effect of humanitarian assistance on people.
We do have two questions that have come in the chat, and I think we have time for just about those two questions. So we'll go one by one. One more question from Mustafa Hassan. He asked, do Palestinians in Gaza carry a travel document called a wathika in order to travel abroad, or do they carry Palestinian passports generated by the PA in the West Bank?
So now they have Palestinian documents, but there was a long time when, where they had travel documents that sort of describe them as, you know, their nationality as undefined. But now they have Palestinian Authority documents.
And one question from Terence Gilhini. How do current Palestinians in southern Lebanon see their future? Or are they now pushing for Lebanese citizenship? Or are they still feeling that this would undermine their right of return?
I think what I heard from Palestinians, I think other people who've worked in Lebanon would say that I don't hear a lot of sort of claims for Lebanese citizenship. More claims, there are lots of claims for civil rights in Lebanon, right? The right to work has been a major campaign among Palestinian refugees, which is slightly different than the question of citizenship. It's that, you know, kind of finding that middle ground between saying, I have a right to a better life here and better circumstances here while still claiming nationality. But people also look to travel, right? It's very difficult to do so, but there's a sort of sense, and people would talk about it as kind of a sense of defeat. Like, I've kind of given up, you know, and of course this is not universal, but some people would say, I've given up, or I think people have given up on the idea of Palestine. We're never going to get it. I want to go to Europe. So, you know, in that space of defeat, it's less about saying, I want to be fully absorbed here, and more, I want to get away. I want some radically other opportunity.